The year was 2847, and humanity had spread across thousands of worlds in the galaxy. But some people still chose to live on the edge of known space, where danger was constant and help was far away. Emily Park was one of those people. She was a xenobiologist, which meant she studied alien life forms on distant planets and moons. She had requested to be stationed alone on a frozen moon called Feneris, where temperatures could drop to -120 degrees during the massive storms that locals called the howling storms. Most scientists thought she was crazy for wanting to come here alone, but Emily had her reasons. 2 years ago, she had lost her husband David Kim in a terrible accident at their research lab on Earth. The explosion had taken him instantly and left Emily with nothing but memories and grief. She had tried to continue working on Earth, but everything reminded her of him. Every hallway they had walked together and every lab bench where they had shared discoveries felt like a knife in her heart. So she ran as far as humanity could go. And she found herself on this frozen moon where the only sounds were the howling wind and the cracking of ancient ice. Her cabin was a reinforced dome built to survive anything the moon could throw at it. The walls were 3 feet thick and made of a special alloy that could handle the extreme cold. The heating system was powerful enough to keep the inside comfortable, even when the outside was cold enough to freeze blood in seconds. Emily had been here for 8 months, and she had grown used to the isolation. She spent her days studying the native creatures of the moon, especially the small ice crawlers that live beneath the frozen surface. At night, she would sit by her window and watch the strange green and purple lights that danced across the sky. But tonight something was different. The weather alert system had been screaming for 6 hours straight. A massive storm was coming, and it was going to be the worst one in decades. The wind speeds were already reaching 200 miles per hour, and the temperature was dropping fast. Emily had secured everything in her cabin and prepared for a long night of waiting. She had enough food and water to last for weeks, and her power cells were fully charged. There was nothing to do but sit and watch the white chaos swirl outside her window. That was when she saw them. At first she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her. The snow was so thick that she could barely see 10 feet beyond her window. But then a shape moved, and then another, and then another. They were wolves. Not Earth wolves, of course. These were Fenrian wolves, the apex predators of this frozen moon Emily had read about them in her briefing files before coming here. The Galactic Union had classified them as extremely dangerous and impossible to tame. They stood 7 feet tall at the shoulder and had silver-white fur that helped them blend into the snow. Their eyes glowed amber in the darkness, and their teeth were long enough to tear through metal. The briefing files had been very clear about what to do if she ever encountered them. Lock down the cabin and wait for them to leave. Do not approach them under any circumstances. Do not attempt to communicate with them. They were animals, and they were deadly. But as Emily watched through her window, she saw something that made her heart ache. The wolves were dying. There were 20 of them, and they were huddled together against the outer wall of her cabin, seeking any small break from the terrible wind. The adults had formed a circle around the smaller ones, trying to shield them with their massive bodies. But even their thick fur was not enough to protect them from this storm. Emily watched as one of the smaller wolves stumbled and fell. It tried to get up, but its legs would not work. The cold was taking it. She saw a female wolf lick the fallen pup's face, trying desperately to warm it. But the female was shaking too, and Emily could see frost forming on her muzzle. The alpha was the largest of them all. He stood at the front of the group, facing into the wind as if he could fight it with his will alone. His fur was matted with ice, and one of his ears was torn from some old battle. Scars crossed his muzzle, telling stories of fights he had survived. But even he could not survive this. Emily watched him sway on his feet, and she knew that if she did nothing, they would all be dead by morning. Her training told her to stay inside. Her briefing files told her these creatures were dangerous. Her survival instincts told her that opening her door to 20 predators was the stupidest thing she could possibly do. But Emily Park had never been good at following orders. She thought about David and how he had always said that the measure of a person was not what they did when it was easy, but what they did when it was hard. He had died trying to save a colleague. From that explosion, he had run toward the danger when everyone else ran away. Emily stood up and walked to her airlock. Her hands were shaking as she entered the code to open the outer door. She told herself it was from the cold, but she knew that was a lie. She was terrified. The airlock hissed open and the wind screamed into the small chamber. She could barely see through the swirling snow, but she could hear them now. The wolves were making sounds she had never heard before. Low whines and desperate calls that sounded almost like crying. She opened the inner door. The Alpha was the first to notice. He turned his massive head toward her, and for a long moment, they just stared at each other. His amber eyes seemed to glow brighter as he studied this strange small creature that had opened the door in the middle of the storm. Emily did not move. She barely breathed. Then the Alpha did something that would later be studied in schools across 12 star systems. He lowered his head. It was not a bow, and it was not submission. It was something else entirely. It was recognition. An acknowledgement that this human had done something unexpected and important. Emily stepped to the side and gestured toward the warmth of her cabin. The Alpha walked past her, and his fur brushed against her arm as he entered. He was so large that he had to duck his head to fit through the doorway. Behind him came the others. The adults came first, checking that the space was safe, and then the adolescents. And finally, the 3 small pups that could barely walk on their frozen legs. 20 wolves entered her cabin, and Emily closed the door against the storm. Her small home, designed for one human, was suddenly filled with alien predators. Their breath made clouds in the air, and their wet fur smelled like snow and something wild. The largest ones had to lie down just to fit. And even then there was barely room to move. Emily stood with her back against the wall and looked at what she had done. 20 pairs of amber eyes looked back at her. She should have been terrified, and part of her was. But a larger part of her felt something she had not felt since David died. She felt alive. The Alpha settled near the door, positioning himself between Emily and the exit. It was a protective stance. She realized he was not trapping her inside. He was guarding her from anything that might try to come in. One of the pups let out a weak cry, and Emily forgot her fear. She pushed past the massive bodies until she reached the small ones. They were shaking so hard she could hear their teeth chattering. Emily knew what she had to do. She moved to her heating controls and turned them up as high as they would go. The system groaned in protest, and she knew it would drain her emergency power reserves. But she did not care. Then she went to her storage unit and pulled out every thermal blanket she had. They were meant for protecting sensitive equipment. But tonight they would protect something more important. The wolves watched her every movement as she spread the blankets over the pups and the weakest adults. They did not growl or snap at her. They just watched with those glowing amber eyes that seemed to understand exactly what she was doing. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin something new was beginning. Emily Park had opened her door to 20 freezing wolves. By morning, everything would change. The storm outside had grown even stronger, and the walls of the cabin shook with every gust of wind. But inside, 20 wolves were slowly coming back to life. Emily had done everything she could think of to help them. She had turned the heat up so high that she herself was sweating in her thin clothes. She had wrapped thermal blankets around the smallest and weakest ones. She had even pulled out her emergency food supplies and was trying to figure out what she could feed them. The protein synthesizer in her kitchen could make almost any kind of food if you had the right program. Emily did not have a program for Volt food, but she knew enough about biology to make something that would work. She programmed the machine to create a thick Paste made of proteins and fats, the kind of nutrients that would give the wolves energy without making them sick. When the first batch was ready, she put it in a large bowl and set it on the floor. Wolves stared at it. None of them moved. Emily understood. They did not know if it was safe. They did not know if they could trust her. She did something that surprised even herself. She scooped up a small amount of the paste with her fingers and put it in her own mouth. It tasted terrible, like wet cardboard mixed with oil, but she swallowed it and looked at the Alpha Sea. She said. Her voice was steady, even though her heart was pounding. "It is safe." The Alpha rose to his feet and walked toward the bowl. He sniffed it carefully and then looked at Emily again. Those amber eyes seemed to be searching for something in her face. Then he ate. The other wolves waited until the Alpha had taken several bites before they approached. Some of them were too weak to walk, and Emily carried the food to them in smaller bowls. She knelt beside the sick ones and held the bowls while they ate. One of the females, a beautiful wolf with silver fur that was almost white, watched Emily the entire time. When Emily came close to feed her pup, the female did not growl or bare her teeth. Instead, she made a soft sound almost like a purr and nudged the pup toward Emily. Trust. Emily realized the female was showing trust as the hours passed. Emily learned more about her strange guests. The wolves had a complex social structure, with the Alpha at the top, but it was not based on fear. It was based on respect. The Alpha did not bully the others. He protected them. He made sure everyone ate before he took his share. He checked on the weak ones and licked their faces to comfort them. Emily found herself watching him more than the others. There was something in his eyes that she recognized, a weight of responsibility, a burden of leadership. She had seen that same look in the eyes of starship captains and colony leaders. This was not an animal. This was a leader. Around midnight, Emily was checking on the pups when she noticed something wrong. The smallest one had stopped moving. She rushed to its side and pressed her hand against its chest. There was no heartbeat. No, she whispered. No. She did not think about what she was doing. Her body moved on instinct. She had trained in emergency medicine years ago as part of her astronaut certification. She had never used it on an alien before, but she had to try. She placed her hands on the pup's small chest and began compressions. The bones felt different from a human's, but she could feel where the heart was. She pressed down in a steady rhythm, counting in her head. Other wolves began to circle around her. Their growls filled the cabin, and Emily knew that if she failed, they might kill her. But she did not stop. She could not stop. "Come on," she said through gritted teeth. "Come on, little one, breathe." The Alpha was right beside her. Now his massive head was so close that she could feel his hot breath on her neck. He was watching everything she did with those intelligent amber eyes. 20 compressions. 30-40. Emily's arms were burning and sweat was dripping down her face. She had been doing this for nearly 20 minutes and the pup was still not responding. "Please," she begged. "Please." And then suddenly, miraculously, the pup gasped. Its tiny body shuddered and its eyes flew open. It coughed and wheezed, and then it was breathing weak, shallow breaths, but breathing. Emily sat back on her heels, shaking so hard she could barely stay upright. She had done it. She had saved it. The mother wolf rushed forward and began licking her pup's face, making those soft, purring sounds of relief and love. The other wolves stopped growling, and the tension in the room melted away. But the Alpha did not move away from Emily, stepped closer until his massive body was right in front of her. Emily looked up at him, and for a moment, she felt real fear. This creature could kill her with a single bite. Instead, the Alpha lowered his head and pressed his forehead against hers. The touch was gentle and warm. His amber eyes closed, and he stayed there for a long moment, breathing slowly. Emily did not know what this meant, but she felt something pass between them, a connection, a bond. When the Alpha finally stepped back, Emily saw something different in his eyes. It was the same look he gave to his pack members, the same look of belonging and protection. He had accepted her the rest of the night passed in a blur of exhaustion and wonder. Emily moved among the wolves, checking on the weak ones, refilling food bowls and changing thermal blankets. They no longer watched her with suspicion. Now they watched her with something like affection too. Of the adolescents followed her wherever she went like curious puppies. They sniffed at her equipment and pawed at her clothes. When she sat down to rest, they curled up on either side of her, their warm bodies pressing against hers. Emily had not been touched by another living thing since David died. She had kept herself isolated, locked away from any connection that might cause more pain. But now, surrounded by these alien wolves, she felt something she had almost forgotten. She felt like she belonged. As the first light of dawn began to glow through the frozen windows, Emily realized that the storm was finally dying. The wind was still strong, but it was no longer screaming. The worst had passed. She looked around at the wolves sleeping in piles all over her small cabin. 20 lives that would have ended in the cold if she had not opened her door. The Alpha was not sleeping. He lay by the door as he had all night, watching over his pack and watching over her. When Emily met his eyes, he made a low rumbling sound in his chest. It sounded almost like thank you. Emily smiled for the first time in 2 years. She did not know what would happen next. She did not know how long the wolves would stay or what she would tell the Galactic Union about what she had done. But she knew one thing for certain: her life would never be the same. Storm had brought these creatures to her door, but something else had made her open. It's something in her heart that refused to let anyone freeze when she had warmth to share. David would have been proud. Emily closed her eyes and leaned against the warm body of the adolescent wolf beside her. Within moments, she was asleep, and for the first time since David died, she did not dream of fire and losh. She dreamed of snow and amber eyes and a door opening wide. Emily woke up buried under a pile of wolves. For a moment she was confused. Her brain could not understand why she was so warm or why she could not move. Then she remembered the storm and the wolves and everything that had happened to adolescent. Wolves had curled around her during the night. Their massive bodies pressed against her from both sides, keeping her warmer than any blanket ever could. One of them was snoring softly, and its breath ruffled her. Emily smiled. She had never had pets growing up. Her parents had been scientists who always moving from planet to planet, chasing the next discovery. But she imagined this is what it might feel like to wake up surrounded by giant friendly dogs. The Alpha was still at the door. He had not slept at all. Emily realized he had stayed awake all night, watching over his pack and watching over her. When she moved, he lifted his great head and looked at her. Good morning, she said softly. The Alpha made that low rumbling sound again, and his tail swished once against the floor. Emily carefully extracted herself from the pile of wolves, trying not to wake them. But the moment she stood up, 3 of them opened their eyes and rose to follow her. They stayed close behind her as she walked to her kitchen to get water. Her food supplies were getting low after feeding 20 hungry wolves all night, but she did not regret it. She would figure out a way to get more supplies later. Right now, all that mattered was that everyone had survived. The Alpha approached the food synthesizer and sat down in front of it. He looked at Emily and then looked at the machinery. You still hungry? She asked. She programmed another batch of protein paste, and the Alpha waited patiently until it was done. Before eating, he looked at Emily and nudged the bowl toward her. She understood. He was offering her first share, just as he did with his pack members. She was not just a rescuer to them anymore. She was pack. Emily took a small portion and ate it. The Alpha seemed satisfied and began eating his share. Over the next few days, Emily observed things that no scientist had ever seen before. Galactic Union had classified Fenerian wolves as dangerous animals, predators that operated on instinct, nothing more than very large, very deadly beasts. The Union was completely wrong. Emily watched the wolves communicate with each other using a complex system of sounds and gestures. There were at least 50 different vocalizations. She counted each with a distinct meaning a low growl meant danger. A high whine meant hunger. A series of short barks seemed to mean follow me, but even more amazing were their eyes. At night, when the cabin was dim, Emily noticed that the wolves' eyes did not just glow, they flickered. Different colors and patterns depending on what the wolf was feeling. Blue when they were calm, orange when they were excited. A rapid flashing that seemed to happen when they were having conversations with each other. This was not instinct. This was language. Emily began documenting everything. She set up her research cameras around the cabin and recorded hours of footage. She spoke her observations into her data log, describing every behavior, every sound, every flicker of light. The alpha was the most fascinating of all. He seemed to understand that Emily was studying them, and instead of being bothered by it, he helped. He would position himself in front of her cameras, as if posing for a portrait. He would demonstrate behaviors for her repeating actions. When she asked him to morning, Emily activated her research drone, a small flying robot that could record video and take samples. She had used it many times to study the ice. Crawlers outside. When the drone lifted into the air, the alpha intercepted it. Emily tensed, expecting him to destroy it, but instead he caught it gently in his mouth and set it down on the floor. Then he examined it carefully, sniffing every part and looking at it from different angles. After a full minute of study, he looked at Emily and made a questioning sound. "It's a camera," she said. "It helps me see things and remember them." The alpha seemed to consider this. Then he picked up the drone gently and placed it back in the air. He barked once, and the other wolves arranged themselves in a group, as if they were posing for a photograph. Emily laughed out loud. It was the first time she had laughed in 2 years. On the 5th day, the alpha came to her with purpose in his eyes. He walked to the door and looked back at her. Then he walked to the door again. It was clear he wanted her to follow. Emily put on her thermal suit and boots. The storm had passed days ago, and the outside temperature had risen to merely very cold instead of instantly deadly. She did not know where the alpha wanted to take her, but she trusted him. The outer door opened and the frozen landscape of Feneris 4 spread out before her. The sky was a deep purple, and the ground was covered in endless white snow. Strange ice formations rose in the distance, like alien sculptures. The alpha walked beside her, and the rest of the pack followed behind. They formed a protective circle around her, keeping her in the center where it was safest. They walked for nearly an hour. The cold bit at Emily's face despite her thermal suit, but the wolves did not seem to notice. Their thick fur was designed for this weather. Finally, they reached a ridge overlooking a wide valley. The alpha stopped and sat down. He looked at Emily and then looked down into the valley. Emily looked, and her entire understanding of this moon changed forever. Below her, carved into the ice, were buildings, not natural formations, not random patterns. These were structures with walls and roofs and doorways. There were streets connecting them, and what looked like a central plaza with a large circular platform in the middle. It was a city, a frozen abandoned city buried under thousands of years of ice and snow. But unmistakably a city built by intelligent beings. Emily fell to her knees. Her legs could not hold her. The shock was too great. The Fenrian wolves were not animals. They were the descendants of a civilization. Emily turned to look at the alpha with new eyes. She saw the intelligence that had always been there, the weight of history, the sorrow of a people who had lost everything. "How long?" she whispered. "How long has it been?" The alpha made a sound she had never heard before, low and mournful, like a song of grief. Then he pressed his forehead against hers again, and she felt his sadness wash over her. Thousands of years. His people had been great once. They had built cities and created art and developed technology. But something had happened, a disaster perhaps, or a slow decline. And now all that remained were the wolves, living as their ancestors had before civilization, and humanity had been hunting them. Emily thought about the briefing files she had read. The Galactic Union allowed hunting of Fenrian wolves as a sport. Rich tourists would come to this moon, pay huge fees and tracked these magnificent creatures through the snow. They called it pest control. They called it population management. They called it sport. It was murder. Emily stood up and looked at the Alpha. Her fear was gone. Her grief was gone. All that remained was a cold, hard determination. I will tell them, she said. I will tell everyone what you really are. The Alpha looked at her with those ancient amber eyes, and for the first time, Emily saw something there that was not sadness, it was hope. Emily spent 3 weeks preparing her report. She documented everything: the city buried in ice, the complex language of the wolves, the way they cared for each other and made decisions as a group. She recorded thousands of hours of video and filled hundreds of pages with observations. When she was finished, she sent it all to the Galactic Union headquarters on Earth. The response came faster than she expected. A ship arrived 18 days later. It was a large vessel painted in the official colors of the Union, and it landed just outside Emily's cabin with a roar of engines that scattered snow in all directions. The wolves had retreated deeper into the cabin when they heard the ship approaching. They huddled together in the back rooms, their amber eyes glowing with fear. They had seen ships like this before. They knew what usually came next. Emily stood at her door and watched as the ramp lowered and a group of people walked out. There were 12 of them in total. Most wore the gray uniforms of Union security officers and carried weapons at their sides. But one woman walked in front, dressed in a crisp black suit that marked her as someone important. Her hair was pulled back tight, and her face showed no emotion at all. She moved with the confidence of someone who was used to being obeyed. Emily recognized her from news broadcasts. This was Grace Lee, the director of the Galactic Union's Xenobiology Division. She was famous for her efficiency and her absolute commitment to protocol. If she thought something was dangerous, she eliminated it. Without hesitation, she was also the person who had signed the hunting permits for Feneris. For Director Lee, Emily said as the woman approached. Dr. Park. Grace replied. Her voice was cold and professional. I received your report. Then you understand, Emily said. These creatures are not animals. They are intelligent beings with their own language and culture and history. We have been committing genocide. Grace looked past Emily into the cabin. Her eyes narrowed when she saw the wolves huddled in the darkness. What I understand, she said, is that you have violated 17 different protocols by housing dangerous predators in a research facility. You have contaminated your scientific objectivity by forming emotional attachments to your subjects, and you have made claims that would require us to admit we have been wrong for 50 years. She stepped closer, and her security team moved with Harry. I'm here to remove these animals and restore order to this facility. You will surrender them immediately. No, the word came out of Emily before she could think. She stepped forward, putting herself between Grace and the doorway. I will not let you take them. Grace raised an eyebrow. Dr. Park, you are one woman. They are one species. We have weapons and ships and the full authority of the Galactic Union. Do you really think you can stop us? Emily did not answer with words. Instead, she stepped aside, and the Alpha walked out of the cabin. He was enormous, nearly 8 feet tall at the shoulder, with muscles that rippled under his silver fur. The scars on his muzzle and his torn ear showed that he had survived many battles. His amber eyes fixed on Grace with an intensity that made several security officers take a step back. The Alpha positioned himself directly in front of Emily, a living shield between her and any threat. Grace watched this with something that might have been surprise. You have domesticated it. Emily shook her head. He's not domesticated. He is my friend, and he understands exactly what is happening here. The Alpha growled, and the sound shook the air. The security officers raised their weapons, but did not fire. They were trained to deal with wild animals, but this creature was looking at them with obvious intelligence, assessing them as threats, calculating risks. It was the look of a general surveying an enemy army. Look at him, Emily said. Really, look. He is not a beast. He is a leader, and he has chosen to protect me just As I chose to protect him, she pulled out a small holographic projector and activated it. Images appeared in the air between them. The frozen sea, the wolves communicating with their eye flashes, the pups playing games that had complex rules, the alpha teaching younger wolves how to hunt. This is what they are, Emily said. A people, a culture. Thousands of years ago, they built cities and created art. They had a civilization, Director Lee, and we have been hunting them for sport. Grace stared at the holographic images. Her face remained blank, but Emily could see something shifting in her eyes. The alpha has a name, Emily continued. In their language, it translates roughly to frost that walks. The female who trusted me with her pup is called Sings to the Moon. The smallest pup, the one I saved, is Morning Light. They are not animals. They are people with names and families and histories. That does not change our protocols, Grace said, but her voice had lost some of its steel. Dangerous species must be controlled. The only dangerous species on this moon is us, Emily replied. We came here, and we started killing them without ever trying to understand them. We called them beasts, because that was easier than admitting we were wrong. The standoff lasted for 3 days, Grace's team set up a camp outside Emily's cabin. They did not attack, but they did not leave either. Every day, Grace came to the cabin to argue with Emily. Every day, Emily showed her more evidence. Every night, the alpha stood guard at the door, never sleeping. Never wavering, the other wolves stayed hidden, but Emily knew they were watching. She could see their eyes glowing in the darkness of the back rooms. 20 lives waiting to learn if they would live or die. On the third night, something changed. Emily was sitting in her main room, exhausted from another day of arguing. She had not slept more than a few hours since Grace arrived, and she could feel her strength fading. The smallest pup, Morning Light, crept out of the back room. Had recovered fully from his near-death experience on the night of the storm. Now he was the most curious and playful of all the wolves, always exploring, always investigating. He was not afraid of humans because Emily was the first human he had ever known. Morning Light walked right past Emily and out the open door. Emily jumped up to stop him, but she was too slow. She watched in horror as the tiny pup approached. Grace, who was sitting alone by the campfire, Grace stood up quickly. Her hand moved toward her weapon butt. Morning Light did not attack. He did not growl or bare his teeth. Instead, he sat down in front of Grace and looked up at her with those big amber eyes. Then he dropped something at her feet. It was a piece of ice carved into the shape of a small human figure. Emily had seen the pups playing with carved ice before. She had assumed they were just toys, but now she understood. They were gifts. Offerings of friendship. Morning Light had made this for Grace. Grace bent down and picked up the tiny ice sculpture. Her hands were shaking. Emily realized it was the first time she had seen any emotion on the director's face. She is beautiful, the pup seemed to say through his eyes. Please do not hurt us. Grace Lee, director of xenobiology, the woman who had signed hunting permits for 15 years, looked at the small carved figure in her hands, and she began to cry. The tears fell silently at first, then great heaving sobs that shook her whole body. She fell to her knees in the snow, and Morning Light pressed himself against her, offering comfort to the woman who had come to destroy his people. Emily walked slowly to stand beside them. The alpha followed, staying close but not threatening. Director Lee, Emily said softly. Grace looked up at her, and Emily saw that something had broken inside her. All the walls she had built to do her job, all the justifications she had used to sign. Those permits, they were all crumbling. What have we done? She whispered. What have I done? You did not know, Emily said. None of yous knew. But now we do, and we have a choice. We can keep making the same mistakes, or we can be better. Grace looked at Morning Light, who was still pressed against her side, offering warmth and trust to someone who did not deserve it. Then she looked at the alpha, who stood ready to fight but also ready to forgive. The next morning, Grace Lee sent a message to the Galactic Council. Her words would change everything. Feneris, 4 species reclassification requested. She wrote full diplomatic protocols Recommended responsible party for first contact Dr. Emily Park, and at the bottom she added a personal note: I was wrong. We were all wrong. But it is not too late to make things right. A new chapter in human history was about to begin, and it had started, with one woman opening her door to 20 freezing wolves. 5 years had passed since the night of the Great Storm. The galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted, and it had all started in a small cabin on a frozen moon where a grieving scientist had opened her door to 20 dying wolves. Emily Park stood at the window of that same cabin, looking out at a landscape that was no longer empty. The valley that had once been silent now hummed with activity. Buildings had risen from the ice, mixing human architecture with the ancient designs of the Fenrian people. Ships came and went carrying diplomats and scientists and curious travelers from across the galaxy. Today was the most important day of all. Today was the signing of the Treaty of Feneris. Emily turned away from the window and looked at herself in the mirror. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. 5 years ago, she had been hollow and broken, running from grief and hiding from life. Now she stood tall and strong, wearing ceremonial clothes that mixed human and Fenrian traditions. Around her neck hung a pendant of carved ice. It was a gift from Frost, that walks made by his own claws, and it marked her as an elder of his people. No human had ever received such an honor before. A familiar presence appeared at her side. The Alpha had grown older in the past 5 years. Gray streaks now ran through his silver fur, and he moved a little slower than before. But his amber eyes were still sharp, and his spirit was still strong. He pressed his forehead against hers in the gesture that had become their greeting, their farewell, and their promise all at once. Ready? She asked him. He made a sound that she now understood as laughter. Deep and rumbling and full of warmth. Together, they walked out of the cabin. Ceremony was being held in the central plaza of the ancient city. The ice had been cleared, and the old buildings had been restored using a combination of human technology and Fenrian knowledge. What had once been a frozen tomb was now alive again, filled with the descendants of those who had built it thousands of years ago. Thousands of Fenrian wolves had emerged from hiding across the moon. They had been there all along, living in underground caves and forgotten tunnels, preserving their culture and waiting for the genocide to end. When word had spread that a human had been accepted into a pack, they had dared to hope. When the hunting had officially stopped, they had dared to emerge. Now they filled the plaza, their silver fur shining in the pale light of the Feneris sun. They stood alongside humans who had come from dozens of worlds to witness this moment. Emily walked through the crowd, and every wolf she passed lowered their head in respect. She was known among them as she who opens doors, the human who had seen them as people when everyone else had seen them as prey. Grace Lee was waiting at the signing platform. She had changed too. The cold efficiency was gone, replaced by something warmer and more human. She had resigned from her position at the Union and dedicated herself to making things right. She had personally tracked down every hunting trophy from the past 50 years and returned them to Feneris 4 for proper burial. The two women embraced. "We did it," Grace whispered. Emily shook her head. "We started it. They did the rest." The ceremony began. Representatives from the Galactic Union read the terms of the treaty. Feneris 4 would be recognized as a dual sovereignty world, shared equally between humans and the Fenrian people. All hunting was permanently banned. A cultural exchange program would bring young wolves to human worlds and young humans to Feneris 4, and most importantly, the first interspecies university in galactic history would be built right here in the restored city. Frost that walks stood beside Emily as the treaty was read. His people had chosen him to represent them, just as they had chosen him to lead them through the dark years of hiding. He did not speak human languages perfectly, but he had learned enough to communicate, and what he lacked in words, he made up for with presence. When the reading was finished, Emily was asked to speak. She stepped forward and looked out at the crowd, humans and wolves together for the first time in history. all waiting to hear what she would say. Emily had thought about this moment for months. She had written dozens of speeches and thrown them all away. Nothing seemed big enough for what was happening here, but now standing in front of them, all she knew exactly what to say. They told me the Fenrian wolves were monsters, she began, her voice carrying across the silent plaza. They called them beasts and threats and dangers to be eliminated, every briefing file, every official report, every hunting permit said the same thing: these creatures are not like us. They do not think, they do not feel. They are animals and nothing more. She paused and looked at Frost that walks. But when I opened my door that night, I did not see monsters. I saw families. I saw parents protecting their children. I saw courage and loyalty and love. The same things that make us human. The Alpha made a soft sound and Emily felt his warmth beside her. The galaxy is vast, she continued. It is full of life that we do not understand. We can meet that life with fear and violence. We can assume that anything different from us must be dangerous. We can close our doors and lock ourselves away from everything that frightens us, or we can choose another path. Emily thought of David in his last moments, running toward the explosion to save a friend. He had never closed a door in his life. On that night, I made a choice. I chose to open my door. And 20 wolves chose to trust a stranger rather than die in the cold. They had every reason to hate us. We had hunted them for generations. We had killed their families and taken their homes. But when I offered warmth, they accepted. When I offered food, they shared. When I saved one of their pups, they welcomed me as one of their own. She felt tears on her face, but she did not wipe them away. That is what humanity can be. That is what we should be. Not conquerors, not hunters, but the species that opens the door. Frost that walks stepped forward. Then he had been practicing this moment for weeks, learning to shape human words with a mouth that was not designed for them. She who opens doors, he said, his voice rough but clear. She is Pack. She is always. Then he lifted his head and howled. The sound rose into the purple sky, deep and mournful and beautiful, and then every wolf in the plaza joined him. Their voices blended together in a song that had not been sung in 1,000 years. A song of honor and belonging and hope. Emily closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her. She thought of all the doors that had been opened since that night. The door of Grace's heart when a small pup offered her a gift. The doors of the Galactic Council when they voted to recognize the Fenrian people. The doors of universities and homes and hearts. Across the galaxy, as humans and wolves began to learn from each other, and she thought of David, she understood now why she had survived when he had not. It was not random chance or cruel fate. She had been spared for a purpose. She had been meant to be here on this frozen moon on this terrible night to open a door that would change everything. David had run toward the fire because that was who he was, and Emily had opened her door because that was who she was. The howling slowly faded and silence returned to the plaza. Emily opened her eyes and found Frost that walks watching her with those ancient amber eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for trusting me." He pressed his forehead against hers one more time. Pack, he said, always. The crowd erupted in cheers, humans and wolves celebrating together a new alliance born from the ashes of old crimes. The first chapter of a story that would continue for generations. Emily Park stood in the center of it all, the woman who had opened the door, and she finally understood that grief had not been her ending. It had been her beginning. That night, after the ceremonies were over and the dignitaries had returned to their ships, Emily walked alone through the restored city. She wandered the ancient streets and touched the walls that had stood for thousands of years. Frost that walks found her there. She looked at him and saw not just a wolf, but a friend. A leader, a soul that had trusted her when trust seemed impossible. "What happens now?" she asked. He sat down beside her and looked up at the stars. His eyes reflected the light of distant suns. "Now," he said, "slowly we build." Emily smiled and leaned against his warm furriness. She agreed. "Now we build," and together they watched the stars until dawn. The door was open, and Neither of them would ever close it again.